rabbinical student at Yeshiva University. And at the same time, I was also going for my master's degree in English literature at City College. It's an interesting schedule. That same year, we had our first baby. Chaim was born in 1969. I just started my job at Sheretz Israel, 1969. So it was a very busy year. I was writing dissertations, taking bechinot. And going back to that early period in my life, I realized I already had a bifurcation. There was already kind of a division. In the morning when I learned at yeshiva, I learned with good old-fashioned, beautiful rabbis who taught us halakha, gemara, and even when we studied Bible, it was studied from a particular Judeo-centered approach. In other words, the Bible is our book. It's there to teach us our stuff, tell us about our history, our ideals, our religious principles, etc. At night, when I was at City College, I had wonderful professors, and one of the courses that I took was on Victorian literature, and the teacher, may he be blessed, was Morton Cohn. He was one of the best teachers I ever had. Morton Cohn taught us Victorian English literature, and the one writer that responded or resounded in my own mind was a man named Matthew Arnold. I had already studied Matthew Arnold at Yeshiva College as an undergraduate, taking a class with Professor Seymour Leonoff. I was attracted to Arnold for a variety of reasons. One, he was a great writer. Two, he was a great poet. Three, he was a great literary critic. All those things were good. But what especially attracted to me was that he spent much of his literary career writing about religion. And in fact, in June 1970, I handed in my master's dissertation of over 100 pages at City University, and the title was The Religious Writings of Matthew Arnold. I dug up that old master's dissertation and I read it again, and it's still good. After 50 years, that's pretty good. And interestingly enough, many of the things I found appealing about Matthew Arnold, I still find appealing. And many of the things I criticized him for, I still would criticize him for. Why is it important today to study Matthew Arnold, who was a non-Jewish writer in England, who was a full-fledged Christian, whose father was a Christian minister, but who had much to say about religion in general, and I think much that relates to the Bible and much relates to Judaism. So let's explore Matthew Arnold. He lived from 1822 to 1888. He was the son, as I told you before, of Thomas Arnold. Thomas Arnold was a very progressive Protestant minister in England. He started a progressive school, and Matthew Arnold was educated in a very progressive way. As he studied, and as he became more and more involved in literature and more involved in religious thinking, he was also impacted greatly by Baruch Spinoza. And Spinoza, as you might recall from previous courses that we gave in the past, was a very fine, keen student of the Bible. The only problem is he didn't believe that the Bible was a divine document. He believed that the Bible was written by human beings doing their best, but it was not a divine document and had no right to command us to do anything. Matthew Arnold liked that very much, and he basically came into that way of thinking. Arnold was a person, you might say, was a Christian by emotion, by thoughtfulness, by tradition, but intellectually he had trouble. In other words, he didn't believe the miracles of the Bible, not even of the New Testament. And there's a famous quotation by him. He attended a church. He used to go to church, interestingly enough. He used to attend church fairly regularly. And he attended a sermon in 1875. And he heard a very powerful sermon discussing some miracles and great things that happened in the New Testament. And then he writes, this is quoting Matthew Arnold, "Never let us deny to this story power and pathos, or treat with hostility ideas which have entered so deep into the life of Christendom. But the story is not true. It never really happened." Oh, this is interesting. So here's a man who was very moved by the sermon, found it very emotionally powerful, but simply wasn't true. Well, what validity is there in a religion? Why go to church? Why read these books? And why listen to these sermons if you think essentially they're not true? Well, let's go to Arnold more carefully now. Arnold believed in what he called culture. Culture means knowing and reading and thinking about the best that has been thought and said in the world, from the beginning of time to now. In other words, there are people from Greece, from Iran, from Africa, from Asia, wherever they are, Europe, the United States, who have something to say. And if we look at the best that has been said in the world, we find that there's something we could all learn. Not only can we learn from them, says Matthew Arnold, we learn a certain literary tact. We learn not to think that there's only one truth, but that there's a variety of ways of looking at things. And we should be able to sit back with the wisdom of the world in our head and be able to read a book with intelligence, not to take it literally word by word, but rather gently, in a philosophical way. So he has several books that he wrote that relate to our topic, and we're going to talk about several of them today. One of them is called Culture and Anarchy. He says, the idea which culture sets before us of perfection and increased spiritual activity, having for its characters increased sweetness, increased light, increased life, increased sympathy. Sweetness and light. A cultured person is a person who's very well read, who thinks carefully, who has opinions, but they're modified. It's not dogmatic. Why is he not dogmatic or she not dogmatic? Because she realizes many people have different opinions. And our goal isn't to say, I have the truth. My goal is that there are truths with small t. And each of us is trying to pursue our own self-perfection and perfection of society. He says, he makes a contrast between our ordinary selves and our best selves. Let me quote Arnold. By our best self, we are united, impersonal, at harmony. He quotes a bishop, Bishop Wilson, who he admired very much. And Bishop Wilson said, firstly, never go against the best light you have. Secondly, take care that your light not be darkness. Oh, beautiful. We're supposed to go by the best light that we have. We have a mind, we have intelligence, we have reason. We study wisely and widely, and we develop sweetness and light. We develop culture. We develop a sensitivity, a sympathy with humanity, which makes us, what he uses the word, not objective exactly, but a way of viewing the world not so passionately involved. Just stand back a little bit. And he says, not only should we follow our own light, but we should make sure that our light be not darkness. Because it's very often, it's very possible that people self-delude. We all think we have the light. The problem is art really light, or is it actually darkness? Is what we're saying true, really true? Or is it just our imagination of what's true since we think we're right and everyone else is wrong? In chapter 4 of this book, Culture and Anarchy, he describes two different approaches to human perfection. And he describes them in two words, Hebraism and Hellenism. Hebraism doesn't mean the Jews as we are today. Hebraism means basically the teachings of the Bible, which for Matthew Arnold didn't only affect Israel of old, but was part and parcel of Christianity as well. So when he used the word Hebraism, it sounds to us, since we're Jewish, we think he's talking about Jews. He's not talking about Jews. He's talking about Hebraism, the Bible, as it impacted on Judaism, of course, but more generally for him, how it impacted on Christianity. So one thing is Hebraism. The other one is Hellenism. Hellenism is, of course, the Greek tradition philosophy. How does he distinguish between these two things? Well, they're both efforts, they're both attempts by human beings to achieve perfection. And they both have very different approaches. So let's see what their approaches are. He says, Hebraism and Hellenism. Between these 2 points of influence moves our world. At one time, it feels more powerfully attraction of one of them. At another time, the other. And it ought to be, though it never is, evenly and happily balanced between them. The final aim of both Hellenism and Hebraism, as of all great spiritual disciplines, is no doubt the same: man's perfection or salvation. Okay, sounds very nice. Both Hebraism and Hellenism are very, very important. But then he goes on to define the distinctive qualities of each of them. The uppermost idea with Hellenism is to see things as they really are. The uppermost idea with Hebraism is conduct and obedience. The governing idea of Hellenism is spontaneity of consciousness. That of Hebraism, strictness of conscience. Okay, now we're starting to see Matthew Arnold a little bit more carefully. He realizes that both of these are very valid and important approaches to life. But you could already see a tilt. What is Hellenism? Hellenism wants to see things as they really are. Intellectual, aesthetic, sense of art, sense of beauty. He calls it the spontaneity of consciousness. We think spontaneously, we imagine, we think, we rationalize, we use our minds. That's beautiful. But then we have Hebraism. Hebraism is strictness of conscience. Whereas Hellenism opens the world to us, Hebraism, in his definition, narrows the world to us. Whereas Hellenism allows us to think and to grow and to imagine, Hebraism causes us to contract, to be obedient, to follow the rules. So he writes, the advantage of Hebraism is 75% of life. I don't know how he came to this conclusion, but 75% of life is conduct, and that's Hebraism. What to do and what not to do, that's Hebraism. But the other 25% is what to think, that's Hellenism. Now, the way he presents it, Hellenism comes out a lot better, but he doesn't dismiss Hebraism. We're going to keep going a little further. He says, as one passes and repasses from Hellenism to Hebraism, from Plato to St. Paul, one feels inclined to rub one's eyes and ask oneself whether man is indeed a gentle and simple being, showing the traces of a noble and divine nature, which is Hellenism, or an unhappy, chained captive, laboring with groanings that cannot be uttered to free himself from the body of this death. In other words, whereas Hellenism liberates us and lets us think, Hebraism, which is conduct, causes us to shrink. It gives us guilt feelings. Whereas Hellenism allows us to explore new ideas and challenge our thinking. Hebraism says, don't you dare think outside of the box. You have to follow our way exactly. And if you follow our way, you'll be safe. And if you don't, you'll be eternally damned. So this presentation is not entirely objective, to say the least. He says, if a person says that the Bible is the one thing needful and we don't need culture, no man who knows nothing else even knows his Bible. And that was a very important sentence to me then, and it's important to me right now. What is Arnold saying? There are people in the world who say, I have the one thing needful. I have the truth with a capital T. And since I have the truth, I don't need anybody else's truth. And in fact, anybody else's truth gets in my way. Well, if I already have it, if I already know the truth, why bother with anything else? And he was criticizing the Bible Belt Christians they weren't the Bible Belt, they were English Christians, but similar to the American Bible Belt people who take the Bible literally. And they say, what do we need philosophy? What do we need Greek thought? What do we need Plato? What do we need Socrates? We have the Bible. The Bible is the word of God. And if God is speaking to us, what else could you possibly need for your truth? You don't need anything else. Matthew Arnold says, if you think you only know the Bible, you don't know the Bible either. Now that's a very interesting concept. People can read the Bible from morning, noon, and night and know it all by heart. But according to Arnold, that doesn't mean you understand the Bible. Why? Because the Bible is not a code. It's a literary work. And a literary work has to be read with literary tact. One has to understand the language of the people. One understands their emotion of the people. So for example, this is off the side, not from Matthew Arnold. There was a question in Jewish law, if you make a blessing, a solar eclipse. In the ancient times, people thought an eclipse was a sign of God's wrath. And so the rabbis, although they made blessings for all of the different natural phenomena, did not make a blessing over an eclipse because they thought that was a curse. It was a sign of God's displeasure. Now, that's what they thought. We now know that the eclipses are a perfectly normal part of nature, and we can predict exactly when they're going to occur. So the question is, now that we know that they're not a curse, should we make the blessing or not? So there's a debate on the subject. And I'm not going to go into the debate. But what does it mean? It means if we don't know the context in which people were thinking, then we don't understand what they said. So if we read a rabbi in the Talmud who says, an eclipse is a curse, if you take that literally, then you're ignorant. Because the only reason they said that is because they didn't know any better. Now that we know better, or we see it in broader context, we're able to judge better. So says Matthew Arnold in the Bible. The ancient people, they experienced natural phenomena or unnatural phenomena that were amazing, unusual. They saw them as being miracles. They didn't know that they were part of nature. So when the Bible has miracles, that's the way the people in olden times talked. They didn't know how else to describe things. Everything was miraculous to them because they didn't know what else to say. So the question that Arnold had to deal with from his critics was this. They say, Matthew Arnold, if you're saying the Bible was basically a human creation, and you're saying you don't believe in the miracles, so why do you go to church? Why are you following all these things? Why do you do these things? So here's what Matthew Arnold says, which is very powerful. It does not help me to think a thing more clearly that thousands of other people are thinking the same thing. In other words, if I think something and other people don't think it, it doesn't matter because my thinking is independent. But it does help me to worship with more emotion if thousands of other people are also worshiping with me. In other words, if you go to shul and there's nobody there, so okay, you go, you still pray. If you go and the shul is full and everyone's enthusiastic, you get lifted also. And Arnold is saying the same thing. The consecration of common consent, antiquity, public establishment, long used rites, national edifices is everything for religious worship. When you go into a synagogue, when we go into a synagogue, it's not merely to say prayers that we're saying right now. There is a mood that is created. We walk into a synagogue and say, you know what? This is the same place that my parents, grandparents, ancestors prayed. The walls are sacred. We're saying the same liturgy that our ancestors said. There's a certain power that comes with the tradition. And Matthew Arnold, being having a great sense of aesthetics, realized that you can't dismiss that those are genuine emotions. And they shouldn't be dismissed, even though they're not, quotation marks, true, even though the prayers may not be ultimately true and the Bible may not be ultimately true. Nevertheless, the overall emotion that's created is very powerful and very spiritual and creates a certain common bond among human beings. Man worships best with a community. He philosophizes best alone. Okay, so this was Matthew Arnold, Hebraism and Hellenism. Now you might think from what I just told you that Hebraism is terrible. Hebraism is a source of guilt and of course talks about sin and conscience. And Hellenism is opening. He does say that, but he also reminds us that the world can't do without Hebraism. The world requires a certain framework for conduct. And here's what I learned from his book called Literature and Dogma. When I was in yeshiva, we studied Bible. And we studied the prophets. Not that much of the prophets, I have to admit, but we had courses we had to take in the prophets. And all those years that I studied the Bible in yeshiva, I never crossed my mind that the essential teaching of the Bible is righteousness. Never crossed my mind. Yes, we were worried about the oppression of the widow and the orphan, but mostly it was about the history, the Jews did sins and they're going to get punished, and the temple's going to be destroyed. All kinds of bad things are going to happen to us because we're sinners. Matthew Arnold, when he read the Bible, what did he see? He saw the greatest expression in the history of the world of righteousness. Whoa. Now I'm in the morning at yeshiva, learning the Tanakh, learning the Talmud, learning Halakha, and there's one framework. And it never occurred to me that all of this is really aimed at one goal, quotation marks, righteousness. And Matthew Arnold, this faithless Christian in England, in 19th century England, understood the Bible in such a way that it brought the Bible to life all of a sudden. And it gave purpose. He says, he quotes so many verses from Tanakh, but his main idea is, righteousness tendeth to life. What does he mean? What was the genius of Israel? Well, let me start with his criticism of modern theology. He couldn't stand the dogmatics of the church. And we could apply that also to the dogmatics of Maimonides, the dogmatics we find in Judaism as well. He said, we all go back to the Bible as a source of God's revelation to human beings, or certainly to the people of Israel. What does that revelation mean? So if you look at Maimonides, gives you 13 principles of faith. You must believe this, you must not believe that, whatever it is. God is not corporeal. They give a lot of philosophical explanations of what God is and isn't. Matthew Arnold says, you know what? If you look at the Bible, there's no such thing as dogma. The ancient Israelites, they were clueless. They were not philosophers. They were not dogmatists. They weren't able to look at the Bible and deduce the qualities of God, what God is and what God isn't. It was totally nothing to do with that. What was Israel's genius? Israel's genius was an intuition, a religious intuition that no other people in the world had. Oh, here's what he says. Only with one people, the people from whom we get the Bible, these distractions did not so much happen. The Old Testament, nobody will ever deny, is filled with the word and thought of righteousness. No people ever felt so strongly as the people of the Old Testament, the Hebrew people, that conduct is 3/4 of our lives and its largest concern. No people ever felt so strongly that succeeding, going right, hitting the mark in this great concern was the way of peace, the highest possible satisfaction. How did the people of Israel know that to righteousness tendeth life? How did the people of Israel know that if you live righteously and you pursue righteousness, you'll be happy and blessed? You could look at the world, in their world also, you could see that people were righteous and they weren't necessarily happy. Nevertheless, Arnold says, in their soul of souls, they understood more than any other people in the whole history of the world that righteousness tendeth to life, that there's something more than meets the eye, that if people live morally in a sense of holiness, the sense of divinity, and a sense of sanctity in their own lives, they are going to be internally happy. They're going to be fulfilled. Oh, this is very beautiful. They realize that that's 3/4 of life. 3/4 of life is to live a life of righteousness. But the other 1/4 of life, which Arnold gives to Hellenism, isn't only Hellenism. Even Hellenism involves conduct and the way of thinking. You could study philosophy and study art and study aesthetics as a pagan Hellenist, or you could do it as a religious Jew or religious Christian or religious Muslim, and you come to different conclusions. So the question that was asked of Matthew Arnold is, these ancient Israelites, you say they weren't philosophers and they didn't have any concept of God. So how do they know that this God even exists? So Matthew Arnold said this: there are different people in the world. The people who are not religious, we're taking out of the equation, but people who are religious. One kind are the establishment rabbis, priests, who give us the dogma. This is what you believe, this is what you don't believe. That's one class. And they fight for this dogma, and they explain the dogma, and they make chidushim from the dogma. Okay, that's one group. There's another group of people, which are the ignorant masses. I call them ignorant masses. They're pious. They follow the rules. The rabbi, the priest tells them this, they follow it. They observe, they keep the mitzvot, they keep the commandments, they show up for church, they show up for synagogue, and that's fine, that's good. And they believe in the Bible. The Bible is given by God. And then there's a third group. I'm talking to the third group. Who are the third group? The third group are people who feel emotionally the power of Hebraism. They feel the power of the Bible, the search for righteousness, but they don't accept the metaphysical aspects of it. They don't accept the miracles. They don't accept divine revelation. They don't accept that there are commandments. It's more internal. Now, this third group of people, Arnold says, is going to be in the future the majority of people. The majority of people, as they study more and they become more scientific and more reasonable, they're going to shake off the vestiges of ancient religion. They're going to demand a religion that is more not metaphysical, that's more intuitive. And where are they going to learn the intuitive religion? From Israel. So Arnold makes a very strange point. So the people of Israel, when they said the word God, they had no idea who they're talking about. They didn't know God. God is corporeal, not corporeal. God is internal. God is infinite. What did they know about these things? They didn't know those things at all. What did they know? They knew that there's some force outside of us that makes for righteousness. So Matthew Arnold's definition of God is the eternal, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. The Israelites felt, I know that righteousness tendeth to life. I know that it brings me happiness and blessedness. I know I didn't create this. It had to come from somewhere. And I know it must be forever. This isn't just what I'm thinking now. This must be true for all human beings. So the eternal, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness, that's God. So what's religion? Religion is morality touched by emotion. So the critics said, "Oh, look, all kinds of emotion. What kind of definition of religion is that? It's not just morality touched by emotion." Arnold says it is. In other words, if you say you should not steal, okay, that's morality. But if you say you should not steal because it's not righteous, because a righteous person doesn't feel validated by stealing, a righteous person feels befouled by stealing, that becomes an emotion. That's what religion is. So Arnold says, when we read the Bible, we should not read it as a set of dogmas, because the people of Israel, they had no concept of dogma, but rather we should read it as literature. Literature and dogma, that's the name of his book. Now, literature means it was written by human beings. Literature means this was their expression, a way of reaching out to some idea that they couldn't completely formulate. And he says as follows: no one has ever come near Israel in feeling and in making others feel that to righteousness belongs happiness. And the way to convince oneself of this is by studying the Bible with a fair mind and with a tact which letters surely alone can give. When you read the Bible, don't read it as a primitive literalist. You read it as a man of letters or a woman of letters. A person of culture reads the Bible and realizes, there's a high emotion in this, there's high literary value in this. And you look not for a way of dogmatizing the language and interpreting the language, you look for a way of saying, what's the spiritual lesson that comes out of the language? Interestingly enough, Matthew Arnold was aware of an ancient Talmudic debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael. He must have come across it somewhere. I'm sure he didn't study Talmud. But Rabbi Akiva used to interpret every little letter in the Bible, every tag, every little sign in above the letter. Rabbi Akiva would make a new drasha, he'd make a new law out of it. Rabbi Ishmael said, Dibra Torah k'lshon bnei Adam. The Torah is spoken in the language of men. The Torah is a literary document. Rabbi Ishmael said so. And Matthew Arnold quotes Rabbi Ishmael. And he quotes the name of the ancient Israelites. He gives us all credit for that. The Israelites realized that the Bible was written with a goal of not providing dogma and not providing philosophy lessons, but providing a sense of righteousness, a sense of goodness. By knowing letters, says Matthew Arnold, by becoming conversant with the best that has been thought and said in the world, we become acquainted not only with the history, but also with the scope and powers of the instruments which men employ in thinking and speaking. And this is just what is sought for. In other words, if we understand the Israelites the way they were then, the Israelites weren't medieval philosophers, they weren't Aristotelians. Excuse me. They were an ancient people who didn't have those things at all. Yet they taught us something very profound. Don't try to read into the past what we think they ought to have thought. They didn't think those things. So Matthew Arnold says, even when they said God, they didn't define God. They couldn't define God. Even though the name Yud He Vav He means God is being, eternal, not ourselves. It was a way of reaching out beyond ourselves without being specifically, without specific definitions. Now, did that mean Matthew Arnold liked the Jewish people? I have to tell you, I don't think he was, I wouldn't call him a pro-Semite. He loved the ancient Israelites. Oh yes, they were great. And the ancient Israelites brought great wisdom to the world, and we can't do without that wisdom. He says, as long as the world lasts, all who want to make progress in righteousness will come to Israel for inspiration. Oh boy. As for the people who have had the sense of righteousness most glowing and strongest, and in hearing and reading the words that Israel has uttered for us, carers for conduct will find a glow and a force they could find nowhere else. If you read your Bible like Matthew Arnold read the Bible, there was no source in the world of any literature of any people that will give you more feeling for righteousness than the Bible. Now, does Matthew Arnold like the people of Israel? Here's what he says. This petty, unsuccessful, unamiable people without politics, without science, without art, without charm, didn't like us. Nevertheless, they deserve their great place in the world's regard and are likely to have it more as the world goes on rather than less. That's a, what do you call it? A double-edged compliment. Even though we're lousy bums now, at least we had once the greatest ideas that the world could have in terms of righteousness. But he says as follows, if Israel spoke of the eternal, it was, we say, because he had a plain experimental proof of him. Arnold objected to the dogmas of the church, and would apply also to the dogmas that are in Maimonides or not in Jewish literature, Jewish philosophy also. He objected to it because he said there's no objective proof for any of those things. How do we know? These people are just speculating. They don't know. And they're presenting as though it's a fact, information we don't know. The only thing we know is what's in our own heart, what we can figure out by our brains. So he said the people of Israel, they had a plain experimental proof of him. What was the experimental proof from Arnold? I'm not sure it's really valid, but he thought so. The experimental proof is when I act righteously, I feel good. That's an experiment. I can, when I do something good, I feel uplifted. If I give charity to the poor person, I walk out feeling great. That's experimental. That's what righteousness is. Righteousness means it tends to life, it tends to blessing, tends to happiness. How do I know it? Because I can feel it. I don't have to speculate. I don't have philosophy about it. I don't have dogmas about it. I can feel in my heart when I behave properly. I feel uplifted. I feel righteous. I feel good. I have experimental proof. And why should I feel better by doing a good deed, by doing a mitzvah? Why should I feel better? It doesn't come from inside of me. There's an external force, eternal, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. God, so to speak, created us or implanted within us, or human beings just have implanted with us, a spiritual sense that makes us understand that righteousness tendeth to life. God was to Israel neither an assumption nor a metaphysical idea. He was a power that can be verified as much as a power of fire to burn the bread, the fire to burn, or of bread to nourish. The power, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. So what about the prophets? What did the prophets of Israel do? So people say, well, the prophets were fortune tellers. They told us the future. No. Here's what Arnold says. The Hebrew prophets did not foresee and foretell curious coincidences, but they foresaw and foretold the inevitable triumph of righteousness. Now, as a yeshiva student going way back then, having studied years and years in yeshiva, I never got that sense that Matthew Arnold was able to give me about this unique genius of Israel to sense for righteousness. In fact, I'll give you a challenge. Review all the sermons you've ever heard from rabbis, except for me, of course, because I talked about righteousness. How many rabbis talk about righteousness? It almost is a bad word these days. It sounds too pious. People talk about the halacha says this, the halacha says that, or they give you a midrash, they give you an interpretation, they give you a clever historical, something historically interesting, anecdotes, midrashim. But who says righteousness tendeth to life? That if we live a righteous life, we are uplifted. That our goal in life is to be uplifted. Now, Arnold, in my upbringing, I didn't hear that very much. Not even in yeshiva, not in my synagogues when I grew up. Arnold centered that in my mind, and it had an amazing impact on me. Not only when I studied the Torah and the rest of Tanakh, but in general religious outlook. It's important to recognize that as much as we study our philosophy and Rambam, which I'm a big fan of, as you well know, it's important also to be able to stand back as literary people and to read these things, read the documents, the primary documents, with literary tact, with the sense, yes, we have a beautiful, powerful, according to Matthew Arnold, the most powerful lessons in righteousness from our tradition. Nevertheless, it's not the only part of humanity. we also have the Hellenism in ourselves that also requires to be fed. And only by balancing Hebraism and Hellenism can we achieve, quotation marks, perfection. Only if we understand that the search for righteousness is a way of empowering us and making us grander and bringing us to a spiritual sense. Also using our minds, using our desire for spontaneity of consciousness. This also is part of who we are. So Matthew Arnold was really calling for culture meaning the balancing of Hebraism and Hellenism. In his own writing, he tilts towards Hellenism. I'm not going to debate that. But his phrases for Hebraism are so powerful that people said to him, if you don't believe in it, why do you go to church? So we said before. So Matthew Arnold said, I believe in stability. The Church of England is a national body. It keeps the whole people together. The teachings of our religion teach righteousness. Let's just stick to those things. And when you come to dogma, I just turn my brain off when they start talking about dogma. I think there's also truth in that. If you go to synagogue and you pray, not only what you're saying, but you really feel all the ghosts of all the generations that came before you, there is a power in it. There is a great power in it. When you read the words of the Bible or the words of our rabbis in the Talmud and the Midrashim, they also were just like us. They're also looking for truth. They're also exploring. They're also trying to reach out beyond themselves. And instead of shutting off our minds and saying, this is the truth with capital T, just sit back, try to understand things in their context, what makes sense to them, what makes sense to us. And then from that framework, we're able to live as more cultured people, as more cultured human beings, and I would say as more religious human beings. So that's what I have to say about Matthew Arnold. Last week, at the end of the class, I asked people if you have any questions or comments just to email me, and a number of you did that. And I'm going to do the same thing now. If you have questions or comments or want additional information, you could email me at mdangel@jewishideas.org, mdangel@jewishideas.org, and I'll be glad to answer anything that way. Next week, we're going to study the Scarlet Letter and other writings of Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne was perhaps the best writer dealing with sin and guilt, and some things of which also crept into Judaism or are also reflected in Judaism, and some things which we have to deal with and kind of put to the side. But it's an important discussion next week about the role of sin in our life, the role of a guilty conscience in our lives. Hopefully we don't have much to be, none of us on this program do many sins, and we're not having guilty consciences, but it's an important theme to discuss. Okay, so have a great day. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to sign off now, okay? And thank you, Rhonda,
Thank you.